Welcome to Chain Reaction, the Foreign Policy Research Institute's flagship network of podcast series examining the political, security, economic, and social trends shaping Europe and Eurasia. Throughout the year, we're talking with experts about developments in Russia's war in Ukraine, the new European security order, the past, present, and future of the Baltic states, Russia's political economy, and great power competition in the region. Join us each month for
Bear Market Brief,
Baltic Ways,
Report in Short,
and of course, our flagship, Chain Reaction. New episodes are available each week on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. This week on Chain Reaction.
Since November of last year, the small country of Georgia has seen daily protests against its increasingly authoritarian government. For some 150 straight days, Georgians have been in the streets, demanding that their country return to the path of European integration and halt what they describe as its slide toward becoming a Russian client state. But the Georgian government has not budged, cracking down on the protests, sometimes with violence, and refusing to consider the protesters' demands for new elections. How might this all end, and what does Georgia's plight mean for the country itself, for Europe, and for the U.S.? To discuss these questions, I'm joined today by an all-star team of former Georgian government officials and current FPRI fellows. Ambassador Batu Kutelya is a non-resident senior fellow in FPRI's Eurasia program. He's a former ambassador to the U.S. and former head of Georgia's Foreign Intelligence Service. During his 17 years of public service from 1996 to 2013, he served in numerous senior diplomatic and national security positions, including Undersecretary of the National Security Council of Georgia, Georgian Ambassador to the U.S., Canada, and Mexico, First Deputy Minister of Defense, and other political military positions at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Vasil Dato Sikharulidze is a non-resident senior fellow in Foreign Policy Research Institute's Eurasia program. He has 17 years of public service experience and held high-ranking positions, including those of Minister of Defense of Georgia, Ambassador to the United States, Canada, and Mexico, Deputy Minister of Defense, Undersecretary of the National Security Council, Deputy Head of the Georgian Mission to NATO, and Head of the NATO Division at the Georgian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Finally, Miro Popkhadze is a non-resident fellow in FPRI's Eurasia program as well. He was the Georgian Ministry of Defense representative to the United Nations from 2015 to 2019. Prior to this assignment, Miro served as the Assistant Defense Attaché at the Georgian Embassy in the U.S. His research areas include Russian foreign policy, Eurasian security issues, geopolitics of the Black Sea and the Caucasus region. So, Batu Kutelya, Dato Sikharulidze, Miro Popkhadze, thank you so much for joining me today on Chain Reaction to talk about what's happening in Georgia.
Thank you, Bob. Thanks for having us.
So let's jump in. Georgia's in the middle of a long-running struggle. We were just talking before we started recording. We're at 148 days of constant protests in Georgia's major cities. And the protests range from probably a few thousand people to, in some cases, tens of thousands or even 100,000 people or more. But they've been going on for almost 150 days. So what are these protests about? And what's the confrontation between the Georgian government and the Georgian people about? Let me start with you, Dato, to get your thoughts.
This is probably the longest, not probably, but for sure, this is the longest protest in Georgian recent history. And Georgians are protesting against this kleptocratic government led by pro-Russian oligarch Bidzina Ivanishvili, who captured state 12 years ago, and then still, since then he was actually trying to undermine Georgia's democratic credentials. But the second phase of this started after Russian attack against Ukraine in 2022. So that was the point when Bidzina Ivanishvili and his proxy government started openly push anti-Western, anti-democratic agenda. Before that, they've been trying to consolidate power with the more or less Western rhetoric, using Western rhetoric, but in reality doing the same. But since 2022, the Russian-style propaganda, Russian-style kleptocratic authoritarianism is in flesh. And the first large protest started with the Russian-style foreign agents law, but then it deteriorated, become stronger after rigged elections of 2024. Last year, the people started started the current protests, which are lasting for 150 days already. With this situation, what we have now is that the government terrible crackdowns on demonstrations, beating people up and then stealing their properties, all of their belongings, and then terribly beating protesters and imprisoning them. Nowadays, we have 53 political prisoners. These are carefully chosen and picked up the youth leaders. They are facing long sentences on totally made up charges. These 53 political prisoners are in jail, including one of the prominent woman journalists who was on the hunger strike for over 25 days. Also, there have been new legislation introduced, the Russian-style legislation that we call it the draconian laws, that has the 5,000 lari fines for the participation in protests, which is in Georgian measures, it's very high, it's 15 times of average pension. We have also hundreds of people under administrative punishment. They've been imprisoned for a week or a couple of weeks or heavily fined. And what we are observing is that the open anti-American, anti-European propaganda, anti-democratic propaganda in the flesh. And it's a Russian-style open anti-Americanism and anti-liberal propaganda that dominates government rhetorics.
Batu and Mira, let me turn to you. Dato mentioned that the start of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia in February of 2022 was sort of an inflection point, at which time the Georgian government switched from sort of pro-Western or Western-style rhetoric, but Russian-style actions. In other words, creeping authoritarianism, but they maintained the pro-Western rhetoric. And then once the full-scale invasion of Ukraine kicked off, the rhetoric became openly anti-Western and openly anti-democratic. So, but in your opinion, why was the invasion of Ukraine a catalyst for that switch by the Georgian government?
Well, thank you, Bob. Yes, to analyze the dynamics is very important. Short answer to your question is that this process evolved or got accelerated after the Russian invasion in Ukraine because the gray zone of maneuverability with this invasion for Georgian Dream evaporated. Because Georgian Dream embarked on the state capture, Ivanishvili embarked on this path of state capture since 2012. We've seen they didn't tailor the laws. We've seen the protests subdued heavily. Even this Gavrilov and the Russian MP came to Georgia. So protest was always there. It was brewing. But still, there was a division or maybe disbelief in Georgia as well as outside. Maybe Georgian Dream is authoritarian, but not pro-Russian. And we've heard this type of stories. And there was a debate about the nature of or anatomy of Ivanishvili's regime in Georgia. But as like in the Hemingway's novel, The Sun Also Rises, when one of the characters was asked how he got bankrupted, and he answers that slowly and then suddenly. So this sudden moment started exactly with Russian invasion because this gray zone evaporated. So it was black or white. Either you are standing with the freedom-loving Ukrainian people and the values of democracy or freedom, or you are with Russia. And that was the momentum when Georgian Dream revealed their true nature, and they were forced by the circumstances to accelerate the process of the state capture, which culminated and reached the climax in the last year October elections, which marked already declared constitutional coup d'etat. It was the state capture slowly going to that moment, and through election they wanted to legitimize already achieved the highest possible degree of institutional capture of the state. So that was the dynamic, and now after was Dato mentioned, heavily deployed all the tools of Putinist type of coercion against opposition, arresting people for their free speech, harassing and arresting journalists, a daily increasing number of the political prisoners who are in the prison simply because they exercise their constitutional right of freedom of the speech or the expressing the protest on the streets, is now full-fledged authoritarianism. And this coup d'etat, and another complication to this case is that this constitutional coup d'etat happened while a pro-Russian Georgian government and Ivanishvili and his clan of kleptocrats conspiring with Russia. Because in these elections and during the pre-election period, we've seen a heavily deployed Russian network and assistance and resources to help them to rig the election and create the so-called fait accompli that Georgia is now some kind of a desovereignized entity under the Russian sphere of influence. So the Russia achieved its goal. They desovereignized once pro-Western, pro-NATO, pro-EU country with its population still predominantly pro-Western, but with the handful number of kleptocratic clan, and on top of it sitting the Russian oligarch with Georgian name, just executing the Russian strategic objective, capturing state of Georgia and desovereignizing it.
That's a great explanation. Thank you, Batu. Let me turn to you now, Miro. Dato mentioned the foreign agents law, and it made news a little bit back here in the U.S., but I don't think there's a real true understanding in the U.S. of what this foreign agents law is in Georgia, what it's about, and what its effects are. Can you take us through that? Give us a short definition of the foreign agents law, and let us know, what does it mean for ordinary Georgians?
Initially, the so-called Russian law was introduced in 2023, and basically it required NGOs and news media outlets to register as for agents of foreign influence, those ones who received more than 20%. Basically, this was intended to stigmatize those institutions, stigmatize NGOs, civil society, independent media, because they portrayed them as agents of foreign influence. And their background argument was that they represent the European Union, United States, and basically they want to open a new front in Georgia. They want to drag Georgia into the conflict with Russia, and they were the only defenders, peace, security, and stability in the country. And that's why they justified their crackdown. They cracked down on civil society, media, dissent, political opponents, because what we are seeing in Georgia is kind of, to a certain extent, a consolidation of this authoritarianism. And they use this as a tool, as a means available at their disposal to consolidate their influence and distance Georgia from the West and realign itself with the Russians. But basically, these are the tools at their disposal, and basically, they, to a certain extent, they erected a complete legislative framework to implement the strategy they have. That, as I mentioned, that consolidation of authoritarianism and state capture. So basically, just now they passed another Russian agent law, and basically they abolish, for example, NGOs' involvement in public decision making. They are pushing out NGOs because they had some kind of right to oversight the appointments at the central electoral commission or High Justice Council of Justice. So basically, they pushed out all the independent entities, civil society, NGOs, free media from the system, and they are full control. Bizina Ivanishvili at the top, and then it's informal agents on the ground and capture state. So basically, what we have seen, it's a consolidation of authoritarianism and realignment with other authoritarian states such as China, Russia, Iran, and etc., etc. So foreign policy has changed and domestic policy have changed, and it's a realignment of authoritarian ecosystem with the Chinese and the Russians and etc. So foreign policy has changed and reversed, and domestic policy also have changed.
Thanks, Miro. So the picture you guys are painting for us here is of a Georgia that is sliding into a system of oligarchic state capture, right? Where the richest man in Georgia, Bizina Ivanishvili, initially formally, he was part of the government after Georgian Dream won the elections, but then informally has been essentially running the government since then. We're seeing a turn toward authoritarianism, a rejection of what we would call, I guess, Western values of a robust civil society, individual freedoms, free market economy, non-use of violence or non-use of force against its own people. We're seeing Georgia abandon all those things. and move in the direction of an authoritarian, anti-Western, pro-Russian, pro-Chinese government, pro-authoritarian government. This in a country that, at least nominally, is still a candidate for NATO and EU membership. So the question then, and I'll turn back to you, Dato, is what does this mean? What does it mean for Georgia in the South Caucasus? If this trajectory that Georgia's on, what does it mean for the country of Georgia, and what does it mean for the region that Georgia finds itself in, the South Caucasus?
Excellent question, Bob. Thank you. For Georgia, it's an existential moment. The Georgia is actually everything you just described, and then our speakers just described, is done against firmed and openly expressed will of 80% of Georgians, even over 80% of Georgians. Whatever this pro-Russian oligarchic government is doing is clearly against the will of overwhelming majority of Georgians and against what they've been, rhetorically supporting during every election. So for Georgia, it is an existential moment. Georgia is choosing between two futures, a democratic European path, and then its natural way of development, or a slide into authoritarianism under Russian influence and Chinese influence, and even the closer ties with other regional players like Iran. Because what we've seen is that we've seen the prime minister attending the funeral of Iranian president. The government is trying to reverse 30 years of pro-Western orientation and silence the will of its own people. So for Georgia, it's, as I said, existential moment. For the region and for our neighbors, immediate neighbors, and for Europe is that Georgia always has been considered as a leader in the democratic and then pro-democratic and pro-European reforms. And now with Georgia going down, it would be really very discouraging, not only for Georgians, but also very discouraging for the reformers around our region. Secondly, Georgia is strategically located, the only viable east-west corridor that bypasses Russia, Iran, and also provides the strategic connectivity for Central Asian countries with the West, goes through Georgia. So South Caucasus is the geopolitical hinge, and if Georgia falls to authoritarianism, the region becomes more vulnerable to Russian and Chinese influence. Not only South Caucasus, but also Central Asia.
Batu, you were ambassador to the U.S. Under the previous Georgian government, as Dato was. Why should this matter for Americans?
Every ambassador here in DC, especially ambassadors of the remote small countries like Georgia, are tackling to explain to the American people and policymakers why our country matters. And with Georgia, I think all the elements of U.S. Strategic interests are at stake in Georgia. U.S. national security interests are at stake. U.S. principles that supports and builds on the rules-based international order is at stake. U.S. economic interests are at stake, and U.S. national security interests are at stake. So I will mention a few components on each of these. First of all, rules-based international order. Russia started revising aggressively this rules-based international order, as in 2007 Putin declared it as his strategic goal at the Munich Security Conference, and unfortunately when it was met a proper response from the Western community, Putin embarked on this path by invading Georgia militarily. Unfortunately, again, Putin was not stopped at that moment. Even just worse, Putin got a reset policy again, and then he decided to further its strategic goals while not only capturing these territories, but also capturing the states, undermining democracy from within. And it's not only in Georgia that we've seen that they've been the utmost successful in terms of capturing the state, which we described earlier, but also meddling in more stable democracies, domestic democratic processes of US, European Union countries, etc. In parallel, of course, waging war against the Ukraine. So if rules-based international order, and the US is the leader of this type of order globally, matters for the US, then Georgia is where it started. So if we want to revert back Russia's aggressive revisionism, we first have to stop this at some point, hopefully in Ukraine, but then also rewind it back and correct all the mischiefs that Russia did. Another is the economic interest, and Georgia being a key player in the region, where important economic resources, energy resources, rare earth metals or strategic minerals are deployed, and to have an access, U.S. needs a reliable partner economically with whom it enjoys open trade, with whom it enjoys strategic partnership, and which will allow U.S. to project its economic interest further in the Central Asia, where China and Russia are trying to dominate, and then they might use it to blackmail U.S. economic interests. As to the national security interest, yes, as Dato and Miro mentioned, Georgia being the most U.S. interoperable, westernized country, military-wise and security institution-wise. That was the result of the reforms that we done in Georgia since 2003, and that's what Russia is trying to revert now by effectively taking control of those institutions. Georgia was the biggest supporter for the U.S. to fight terrorism and radical extremism in the region. Georgia was key and the biggest contributor to all the anti-terrorist operations that were targeted to against U.S. interests. These terrorist organizations were not targeting Georgia or any countries, even while they operate in the region. Their biggest strategic goal was to undermine United States credibility. And Georgia was on the front line with the US. So we have all the components in place, as I said, economic, political, moral, or value principle-wise, where US interests are at stake in Georgia. And another important component on top of it, or umbrella, is a freedom fighting of Georgians for our freedom, which has been always supported and inspired by Americans. Even during the Soviet occupation in 1954, U.S. Congress adopted a resolution and produced a report where they were stating that there is no signs or the reasons that Georgians will give up their sovereignty and their fight for freedom. So even under Soviet occupations, Americans believed in our struggle for our freedom and supported morally and politically. So all this in place, of course, gives a strong argument why Georgia and the small nation of freedom-fighting people is important for U.S. interests.
So thank you, Batu. Let me turn to you, Miro, because you're from Georgia, but you have also worked for a long time in the U.S., part of that time as a Georgian diplomat, both at the Georgian embassy in Washington, D.C. and at the Georgian UN mission in New York. So let's turn it to U.S. politics now and the U.S. approach to Georgia. So what approach do you see the Trump administration taking toward Georgia, and how might that differ from the approach the Biden administration took?
Yeah, that's a very good and very relevant question, Bob. Thank you very much for it. Basically, the biggest challenge for not only Georgia, but for the Black Sea region was the lack of policy, lack of strategy from American perspective. That's why the region suffered dramatically. That's why we have conflicts in Ukraine, we had in Georgia, but Georgia is bigger than Georgia. Actually, it's very important place for the region because Georgia was the linchpin of American and Western influence, and Western influence over Western ideals, principles, and could expand in Central Asia, etc., etc. And my colleagues very well actually articulated why Georgia is important. But what we see still at the early stage of this policy development at the current administration, but what we see now is that while the current administration is supporting Georgia's Western aspirations and integration into Western institutions, it is, and the sovereignty, it is a deprioritizing democratic issues, and democratic conditionality, I would say. Focus is more on global geopolitical competition and the region, it reflects in the region, and that's why it pays less attention what's going on in Georgia domestically. For example, Georgia's democratic backsliding, like a so-called Russian law, while the previous administration viewed the world in terms of a fight between democracies and autocracies, and very often they were very vocal criticizing Georgia for their introduction of this foreign agent law. They sanctioned Ivanishvili and his cronies, and they were very, very serious about it. So basically what we can say is that the previous administration, Georgia's previous administration's narrative between democracy and autocracy. But now that we see this kind of geopolitical competition. Previous administration, I would say, was more conditional and value-based, while this one is more transactional and the focus is more on geopolitical competition, with China, for example, and pays less attention to democratic issues. So now the administration is a little quiet when it comes to what's going on in Georgia.
So thanks, Miro, for that explanation. Let me stay with you and ask the last question. First to Miro, then Batu, and then Dato will give you the last word. How does this end? So this looks to me to be an existential struggle between Georgia's very robust and Western-oriented civil society. Dato, you gave the figures in terms of public opinion polling about, the Georgian people are strongly pro-Western and very skeptical of Russia. But it seems to be an existential struggle between Georgia's civil society and Georgia's authoritarian government, where neither one or the other has to win. And so, Miro, what's your sense of how does this end? 150 more days of protests, or is there an inflection point likely somewhere?
Well, that's an inflection point. That's a very good question. Georgians are fighting. Majority of the population is pro-Western. They are fighting mostly like urban population, young people who have received education in the West. So that's the majority. So I think United States and European Union together, they need to support these people. That's the future, because the support for these people who fight for democracy and Georgia's independence is not for just Georgia. It's for the region, for a Western way of life, for Western principles, ideals. Because if these people win, Georgia wins and West wins in Georgia. Because now we see what's going on in Armenia. Armenians are really trying, and they are struggling. They want to connect with the West. They want to integrate in the Western institutions. So if these people fail and democracy fails in Georgia, then Georgia is the key linchpin to the Western influence. So Georgia fails, and then Armenia fails, and the whole region will fail, and then Chinese will take over, because Chinese are increasing their influence and they are taking advantage of Russia's security stance there. So we will see that the Chinese influence will increase along with the Russians, and it will be the great zone, and the U.S. will lose its ally and partner, and it will lose the region. So this will be the end. So that's why United States needs to pay attention what's going on the ground, and it needs to increase its involvement, supporting civil society, independent media, people, because majority of people are really pro-Western. As you know, Bob, on the ground, people are very American-loving people, freedom-loving people, and this will be very unfortunate if they don't receive the assistance and help from the West. It will be big loss for the West and for the United States.
Thanks, Miro. Let me turn to you, Batu. Anything to add to that? Is there a more optimistic scenario available? So can Georgia solve this on its own in a way that preserves its Western orientation?
Time is not working on us, and the leverages that will allow us to steer processes to the best case scenario is slowly diminishing. And as we described, that has the different reasons, but whatever the reasons were, and we discussed it already, the most important thing is what can we do right now. So assessing the situation for a best case scenario, there are not enough resources internally in Georgia right now to change this trajectory of the state capture or constitutional coup d'etat. With this type of degree of state capture, where every institution is under the control of the individual, Bidzina Ivanishvili, with huge resources supported by Russia, deployed the propaganda assets and coercive measures, arresting people and having an increasing number of political prisoners, only component that will embolden the protest. But protest is key and necessary precondition, but not sufficient. To embolden this process and to steer situation in a shortest possible period back will require interference from the West. We already have a Russian interference. So to counter Russian interference, we need a Western interference with a more tough, big-scale, large-scale coercive measures, sanctioning not only Ivanishvili and his family, but entire network of its enablers. And these people and names are well known and being communicated to our Western partners. It requires a political will to do these coercive measures. Yes, ordinary Georgians will suffer as a result of it in a short term, but it's a necessary means to turn the situation in a proper way. If this won't happen, then I'm afraid that we have a worst case scenario as I mentioned before, desovereignized entity Georgia will becoming a proxy of Russia, even more desovereignized than even Belarus or other Russian proxies, more Chechnya type of criminal kleptocratic annex of the Russian gray zone of operations. And there is a third scenario in between. So the struggle will continue and it will be a slow burning process, which eventually end up in a much worse situation. But also this will be a big embarrassment for the West because it will happen on our watch, on the Western's watch, that Russia slowly, gradually, with the strategic assets deployed in the region, takes back the once pro-Western and promising democratic country in the region, which will have a domino effect on other interests of the EU and US in the region.
Dato, anything to add to that? Absent Western use or U.S. use of its leverage against the Georgian government to raise the cost of its authoritarian slide, is there a way for Georgia to find its way out of this cul-de-sac it's in?
Well, yes, I have hopes for this. Georgia is being punished basically for standing up against Russia. In 2008, Georgia was the first country since 1979 which Russia attacked with military force, invaded and occupied. But Georgia was brave enough to stand up and then maintain the way we have chosen, way of building democratic country, EU and NATO integration, and then modernization of the governors. Then therefore, it is important for Russia, for the psychological, for the geopolitical, and also for political reasons to exemplary punish and that undermine and destroy the Georgian state. But I am still hopeful because it's been 150 days that people are protesting outside, and then people are in jail. People are bravely continue this progress, and then this is not free for them. This costs their jobs, and some of them they cost a lot of money and a lot of big fines. Government goes after practically all activists, and then now it's a very important crossroad for Georgians. I do see will of Georgians that not to refuse becoming the Georgian Russian-style authoritarian state, and then I hope that this will bring us to the changes. However, I think I completely agree that support of our European and American friends is absolutely necessary, not only in Georgian people's interest, but also it is in the interest of US and EU itself.
So thank you, Dato. That's going to have to pass as our optimistic note to end on, even though I think that's as much optimism as we can muster. It's been a rough situation in Georgia for several years now. I think we have to acknowledge the resiliency and the determination of the Georgian people, 150 straight days of protests with no end in sight. I guess the optimistic note is that the civil society, the robust and resilient civil society that Georgia enjoys, may be what saves it from a permanent slide into authoritarianism. So, Batu Kutelia, Dato Sikharolidze, Miro Popradze, thank you so much for joining me today on Chain Reaction. I found this discussion fascinating.
Thank you, Bob.
Thanks for tuning in to Chain Reaction, a podcast of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, examining the political, security, economic, and social trends shaping Europe and Eurasia. Throughout the year, we're talking with experts about developments in Russia's war in Ukraine, the new European security order, the past, present, and future of the Baltic states, Russia's political economy, and great power competition in the region. Note that the views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of FPRI. I'm your host, Dr. Bob Hamilton, head of Eurasia Research at FPRI. Visit us at fpri.org for more on today's topic and many others in the world of foreign policy and national security. Thanks for listening. See you soon.